Hey everyone, welcome back to Study Hall, where we like to, really get into the nitty-gritty of things.
Yeah, get those brains working.
Exactly.
Mm.
So today we're going to be looking at something that on the surface might seem kind of, well, bureaucratic.
A little dry, maybe?
Yeah, an executive order. But
Sure.
trust me on this one, this particular order opens up a whole can of worms.
Oh, yeah. It really gets at the heart of some major shifts in how the government's thinking about social issues these days and the role of, faith-based organizations.
Exactly. And the source material for today's deep dive is an excerpt from the White House website. It details the establishment of this new thing, the White House Faith Office.
And it was just signed yesterday, February 7th, 2025.
So fresh off the press, practically, the timing is interesting,
Yeah.
right? Like it's pretty early on in the new administration to be making such a, bold move.
Well, you have to remember, executive orders can be a very powerful tool for a president, especially when they want to signal a clear change in, priorities or maybe bypass a lengthy legislative process, how that can be.
Well, yeah, gridlock city.
Yeah, right. So this early in a term, an executive order often points to, campaign promises being put into action or a response to a pressing issue that they want to address right away.
So they're hitting the ground running.
Exactly.
So let's get into the weeds here.
Hmm.
The order states that the purpose of this White House Faith Office is to assist faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship
Uh-huh.
in achieving some pretty big goals, like strengthening families,
Yeah.
promoting work, and protecting religious liberty. I mean, these are all huge, complex issues with a long history of, debate.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this order so interesting. It really suggests a pretty deliberate shift toward empowering faith-based organizations,
Yeah.
as key players in
Right.
addressing these social
But
challenges.
they're not just service providers anymore.
Right. It's about recognizing them as partners in shaping policy.
And you see that partnership model come up again and again throughout the order.
Oh, yeah.
They even talk about a level playing field for faith-based groups when it comes to getting federal funding.
Right, which of course raises all sorts of questions about how that will actually work, on the ground.
Right. Like, how do you ensure fairness and equal opportunity while also navigating the complexities of religious freedom and potential conflicts of interest?
Exactly. And how do you measure the effectiveness of these partnerships? I mean, are they actually achieving the outcomes they're aiming for?
Those are some big questions.
Big questions that policymakers and researchers are going to be grappling with for a long time.
And one thing that really jumps out at me is the language around ending religious discrimination.
Uh-huh.
What kind of impact could that have on existing laws and policies?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. It really depends on how this language is interpreted and implemented.
Okay, so it could lead to new legislation.
Potentially, or changes in how existing laws are enforced.
Hmm.
It could also affect how government agencies interact with faith-based organizations, everything from hiring practices to how resources are allocated.
So this executive order is not just about, high-minded ideals.
No, it's about concrete action.
And that's where things get really interesting, right?
Absolutely. And the order gets very specific about what this White House Faith Office will actually do.
Like what?
Consulting with faith leaders, advising on policy changes, and identifying barriers to religious freedom.
So they're going to have a seat at the table.
Oh, yeah. This positions them as a powerful advocate within the administration.
This is not just symbolic. We're talking about an office that could really shape the political landscape.
And that's why it's so important to examine this order critically. Think about the potential benefits, but also the potential risks.
Right.
Like, how will this impact the separation of church and state? Will certain religious groups be favored over others?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right? And how will this affect the delivery of social services to those who may not align with, the dominant religious perspectives?
Those are questions that we need to be asking.
Absolutely. These are questions that demand careful consideration.
Let's dive into some of the specific areas of focus outlined in the order. They talk about protecting women and children, strengthening families, combating anti-religious bias.
Promoting education, addressing crime and substance abuse, and something they call fostering flourishing minds.
Okay, flourishing minds. I like that.
Yeah, the language itself is really interesting, isn't it? It speaks to a particular worldview, one that emphasizes personal responsibility and the role of faith in achieving well-being.
That flourishing minds concept that really stood out to me.
Uh,
I mean, it's not the kind of language you typically see in government documents.
yeah, it's different.
Almost like they're trying to redefine what it means to thrive.
And that's where things get really interesting. Are we talking about a narrow definition of flourishing that aligns with a specific set of religious beliefs?
Hmm.
Or is there room for a more inclusive interpretation that embraces the diversity of values and experiences in our society?
These are the kinds of questions that this executive order brings up.
And these are the questions we'll keep exploring as we, dig deeper into this order. Okay, so let's think about how these, pretty lofty goals might actually translate into action. Like, what's the concrete stuff?
Right, rubber meets the road.
Exactly. And the order does get into some of the nuts and bolts. It talks about grant opportunities for faith-based organizations,
Hmm.
especially those that maybe haven't had a lot of experience with securing government funding.
Okay, so potentially a lot of money flowing into these communities.
Hmm.
I mean, that could have a huge impact on all kinds of grassroots initiatives, right? Things like poverty, homelessness, family support.
Right.
But I do wonder, is there a risk that we might overlook secular organizations that are doing equally important work?
That's a really good point. Some critics might argue that this focus on faith-based organizations could create an uneven playing field
Right.
and, maybe put secular groups at a disadvantage.
Hmm.
The order does mention collaborating with other agencies to make sure there's, diverse representation among grant recipients.
Hmm.
But we'll have to see how that actually plays out.
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Exactly. And the order also talks about training programs for these faith-based organizations.
Interesting.
Yeah, helping them navigate the grant process and understand the regulations.
That makes sense. I mean, a lot of these groups might not have the infrastructure to deal with all that government bureaucracy.
Right, exactly. It's about capacity building, making sure they can actually use those resources effectively.
Yeah.
And it also mentions something else, training on religious liberty exceptions, accommodations, and exemptions.
Okay, now that's interesting. Could you unpack that a little? Like, what are the implications there?
Sure. So it's basically about ensuring that these faith-based organizations can operate, within their religious beliefs while also participating in government programs.
Okay, I see.
So, for example, you might have a religious adoption agency that wants an exemption from placing children with same-sex couples if that goes against, their doctrine.
Right.
So these exceptions, they're meant to protect religious freedom. But they've also, caused a lot of debate about potential discrimination.
Right, because how do you balance religious freedom with the rights and needs of everyone?
That's the key question, isn't it? And the order does acknowledge this tension.
Okay.
It says that the White House Faith Office will work with the Attorney General to investigate any failures to enforce existing protections for religious liberty.
So kind of like a checks and balances thing.
Yeah. Exactly. A way to prevent discrimination while also upholding religious freedom, but, it's a tough balance.
It sounds like a tightrope walk.
It is going to take constant vigilance and, a willingness to really listen to different perspectives.
Absolutely. And this is where, public engagement becomes so important.
Right.
The more we understand this executive order, the more we can participate in these conversations and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more.
And speaking of public engagement, there's a part in the order that talks about encouraging private businesses to support employee volunteerism and charitable giving.
Oh, right. Even suggesting, payroll deductions for those purposes.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it could have a big impact.
Absolutely. It's like they're encouraging the private sector to get on board with this agenda, promoting philanthropy that's directed toward faith-based initiatives.
So it's like an extension of that partnership model, bringing businesses into the fold.
Right, and that raises some questions too. Could this lead to situations where companies feel pressured to support specific religious organizations?
Right. Even if it clashes with their own values or their employees' beliefs.
Exactly. Imagine a company where most of the employees are from one faith, but they feel obligated to donate to charities that align with a completely different religious perspective.
Yeah, that could create some real tension.
Absolutely, whose values are being prioritized.
This executive order, it's like an onion, layers upon layers of complexity.
It really is, and every layer has its own set of potential benefits and risks.
It feels like we're seeing a major shift in the relationship between the government faith-based organizations and the private sector.
It's not just about tweaking things here and there.
No, it's much bigger than that.
It's a fundamental rethinking of how we approach social issues and, who gets a say.
Before we wrap up this part, I want to circle back of that idea of fostering flourishing minds.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that language could be interpreted as, prioritizing a particular worldview, one that maybe excludes people who don't share those beliefs?
It's definitely something to consider. The language sounds positive,
Yeah.
but it's also kind of vague.
Right.
Like, what exactly is a flourishing mind, according to the people who wrote this order? Does it include different perspectives on well-being, secular humanism, different cultural traditions, even different interpretations within faith communities?
Those are important questions.
We need clarification. We need open dialogue.
It seems like this executive order, while it's presented as, a way to make society better,
Yeah.
it also raises a lot of questions.
And those questions are exactly what make this such a fascinating area to explore.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into this executive order, I'm really struck by just how wide-ranging its impact could be. We've talked about funding partnerships, these training programs, religious liberty, even the role of private businesses. I mean, it's a lot.
It really is a lot to consider, and I think it's important to remember that we're really just at the beginning. We're just starting to understand how all of this will actually play out.
Yeah, it's all very theoretical right now.
Exactly. I mean, this executive order, it's like a blueprint. It lays out some guiding principles, some directives, but the real work, the actual implementation of all this, well, that's just getting started.
It's one thing to talk about the ideas, but the real-world application, that's what matters.
Absolutely. And that's why we need to look beyond the text of the order itself. Consider the bigger picture. How will this initiative fit in with existing social service programs? What are the potential unintended consequences? And those could be both positive and negative.
Right, you never know.
Exactly. These are questions that we're going to need to keep asking. We'll need to observe, analyze, and maybe even make some adjustments along the way.
And one thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of mission drift. What happens if faith-based organizations become more and more reliant on government funding? Could that subtly influence their priorities? Maybe even compromise their core values?
It's a legitimate concern, and it's something we've seen before with similar initiatives. There's a risk that, in trying to secure funding, maintain that good relationship with the government.
Yeah, right.
These organizations might start to shift their focus away from what they originally set out to do.
It's tricky, right? Because you want to support these organizations. Yeah. You want them to be able to do good work.
Of course.
But at the same time, you don't want to create a situation where they're beholden to the government or feel pressured to conform to a certain agenda.
It's a delicate balance, and it really highlights the need for transparency, accountability, open communication between these faith-based organizations, the government, and the communities they serve.
Speaking of communities, I'm curious about how this executive order might impact people who don't identify with any particular religion or maybe have different spiritual beliefs.
Right.
Will their needs and perspectives be represented in this new system?
That's a crucial question, and honestly, one that the order doesn't really address. We have to make sure that any initiative like this, that aims to empower faith-based organizations doesn't end up marginalizing or excluding people who don't fit neatly within that framework.
And that brings us back to a fundamental question.
Yeah.
How do we create policies and programs that respect individual religious freedom, but also ensure equal treatment for everyone, regardless of their beliefs?
It's an ongoing challenge in a diverse society, and it requires, constant attention, critical thinking, and a willingness to have these tough conversations respectfully.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I think it's safe to say that this executive order, it's more than just a piece of legislation. It sparked a much bigger conversation.
Yeah.
About the role of faith in public life, the relationship between government and religious institutions, what it means to have a just and equitable society.
Well said. And I think the most important thing is that we approach these conversations with curiosity, with open minds, and a willingness to find common ground even when we disagree.
And to all our listeners out there, we leave you with this. How do you see this executive order playing out in your own community? What are the opportunities, the challenges? What do you think? We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, talk about it with each other, share your insights, and until next time, keep those minds sharp and keep asking those tough questions.